This is one of the last programs that we'll be doing in this space. And we have one more, which I'll announce in a second. And then, starting November 10th, you'll all be in a world-class, state-of-the-art black box performance space for more lectures and events on Highway 27 in the new Herzog & de Meuron Design Parrish Art Museum. So, this has been a long time coming, and I know that a lot of you are really looking forward to it. And as you know, we will be opening to the public on November 10th. And all I can say about that is that those of you who are sitting in this room that are not members right now are going to want to be, because there's a preview of the building between November 4th and November 10th for members. And the higher up in the food chain you are as members, the more prestigious and less people your preview will be. So we have plenty of membership information for you, and please join us. It's a community museum, and we want you to be a part of it. I want to also let you know that on Saturday, August 11th at 6 o'clock at Camp Hero State Park in Montauk, we have one of our presentations under our program, the Parrish Road Show. This is a great project that was developed by our curator of programs, Andrea Grover, who is functioning tonight as our cinematographer, who has produced a series of events of the Parrish Art Museum on the road as a way to start moving us from Job's Lane to Montauk Highway. This is Alice Hope. She's doing a project called Under the Radar, which I can tell you is under the radar, and it's really, really great. If you can, get out there for the reception, 6 to 8 at Camp Hero, but the installation will be on view until August 31st. So take the chance to go out to Montauk and have a look at that. On the other Parrish Roadshow event will be Friday, August 17th, called What Comes Around. It's a project by Jill Municki, sorry, she's not in the audience. 6:30 to 8:30 at the Bridgehampton Historical Society. Part of the Parrish Roadshow is collaborations with other cultural institutions on the East End. We're very proud of that. And our very last program in this series will be Untold Stories, a talk by David Rockwell, which will be Thursday, same time, same place, August 23rd. So if you join now and become a member, you can sign up for that program, and you won't have to worry about getting shut out when it's sold out. And now, Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel. So many things that she has done and contributed to our cultural world that I had to write them all down, and I'm just going to list them. Chairperson of the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center, Vice Chair of the New York State Council on the Arts, a Director of the Trust for the National Mall in Washington, D.C. She was the first Director of the Office of Cultural Affairs of New York City. She is the longest-serving Commissioner of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission and the first woman Vice Chair in the more than 100-year history of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts. She also, amazingly, turns out to be a great curator in her own right of exhibitions as well as talks and programs, and we're thrilled to have her here today with Robert A.M. Stern. Welcome, Barbaralee.
Thank you, Terry, and thanks to each and all of you for joining us here tonight. I'm Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel. The name of our conversation tonight is Honoring the Past Without Neglecting the Future. Opportunities for creative change. You have cards on your seat because at the end of our conversation, we would like the audience, thank you, we would like the audience to participate as well. So if you will take a card, and if you have a question, please write it down. There are volunteers that will pass it forward. And at the end of the conversation, Robert Stern will reply to your inquiries.
Graciously.
As always. Robert Stern was an architect, designer, preservationist, teacher, curator, author, the recipient of many honors and awards. He received the AIA New York Chapter Award in 1984, and the chapter's President's Award in 2001. He received the 10th Vincent Scully Prize from the National Building Museum in 2008, and in 2011, the Dreyhouse Prize. Prior to becoming dean at the Yale School of Architecture, 16 years ago, he was a professor of architecture and director of the Historic Preservation Program at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. He has designed many noted buildings, such as the Robert Byrd United States Courthouse and Federal Building in Beckley, West Virginia, the 1992 Master Plan for Times Square in New York City, many, many projects for the Walt Disney Company, the noteworthy, newsworthy 15 Central Park West in New York City, the East Hampton Town Hall, and recently, the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, and the George W. Bush Presidential Library in Dallas, Texas. Both are nearing completion. He has designed government buildings, residential buildings, and corporate buildings, cultural educational institutions, and in addition to that, he is a prize-winning and prolific author of books about architecture and in many ways the history of New York at the same time. Please join me in welcoming Robert Stern. As he speaks, you may have a question, so write it down and hold it up and someone will collect it. Your buildings incorporate so many varieties of styles. How would you like to be described?
I think of myself and the work we do in our office as modern traditionalism in general. We do not subscribe to the idea that at any given moment in our very complicated world that there is one true way of designing. This is not the Middle Ages in France. Times have changed. And there are many different situations we encounter as human beings in our world, and we must adjust our ideas to those different places. So I think of myself as a portraitist of places rather than an autobiographer. Many of my fellow architects are heavily into autobiography.
On the one hand, you're known for designing countless homes, including apartment houses, office buildings, libraries, museums, and schools. And on the other hand, for serving as the dean for the past 16 years at the Yale School of Architecture, arguably the most distinguished school of architecture in our country, known for its dynamic and demanding programs. In addition to that, you have a very long list of books that you have authored and edited. How do you manage to do all of this, and which do you really prefer?
Oh, well, I like to do everything.
Could you slide down a little bit closer?
Want us to be too intimate before dinner, Barbara. We are old friends.
I say long term.
When Carl is sitting in the front row.
So which do you prefer?
I don't have any particular preference. I really don't. I mean, it's like asking, it's easy to ask me which child I prefer since I only have one, but he's here. I don't have any preference. And I also, in order to do all the kinds of things I have done and do, I have lots of help. Some of my partners here, Gary Brewer, Randy Carell are in the room because we have projects here and they've been out here today working on them. It's a collaborative effort, but I like to think that I'm the captain of the ship. I steer the course.
You have a very devoted office staff. Are there 250 to 300 architects that work with you?
No, I mean, there are maybe 250 people in the office, but they're not all architects, yeah.
Because the range of your work includes buildings, interior design, as well as planning?
Yes, and also I have a few collaborators like David Fishman and Jake Tylov, in particular Sarah Atchison, who helped me with my books. Even that's.
How many of them are there now?
Oh, there are those hardy 3 and a few more on the side. I'll put anybody to work on anything I think needs to be done at any given moment.
Pretty good. Perhaps you can tell us now about your current priority project. And would you be good enough to start by telling us their current status and future use? Why don't we begin with the Museum of African Art in New York City?
Well, that's an amazing project which, now that the parish has raised all its money, maybe we can get a few dollars for the African Art Museum.
Not all of it, yeah.
Not all of it. But it's a museum that was started, I've forgotten now, 20 or 25 years ago, and it's had a slightly nomadic existence in Manhattan and even moved to Long Island City at a certain point. But now we have designed a building as part of a larger project, an apartment house at the northern end of Fifth Avenue and facing Central Park. And the museum will be there in a first-class museum facility, but they are trying to do it right. And it's very expensive to build a building in New York. Not to say it isn't expensive to build one out here. And they're a little short of cash, so Elsie McCabe is yet again in a fundraising mode. But we hope to.
Is there a projected opening date for the museum?
I don't commit to that anymore. It's a moving target.
And while you talk about nomadic projects, why don't we address the American Revolution Center that in 2002 started out in Valley Forge and migrated to Philadelphia. Can you tell us some of that story?
That's an interesting story in my view, and maybe addresses some of the broader themes of tonight's discussion. The idea that there is no museum dedicated to the American Revolution. There was none until fairly recently dedicated to interpreting the United States Constitution. And as you know, one was built at the top end of the mall in Philadelphia, opened about 8 years ago. Other people wanted to have one in the Revolution and thought perhaps that Valley Forge, where Washington forged the army that really won the war for us, on that site, and spent that famous winter there, would be an excellent site. And there is a park in Valley Forge, which was a state park, state of Pennsylvania, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and then was taken over by the federal government, and we found, on behalf of our clients, a wonderful site for a building, and we thought it would be great to get people to come out there and they could really experience art. There's an old village in the park, and there's quite a few monuments, but as the people who love trees sometimes don't love buildings, and the locals who live around the park got to think of it as their park, not the American people's park, and it became very complicated. Long story short, we then moved our site to a different part of the park, designed the building a second time, and then finally an agreement was made whereby the parkland was swapped, the site in the park was swapped for a site 2 blocks from Independence Hall on Chestnut Street, corner 3rd, if you know Philadelphia, right in the center of the most important events of the founding of this country. So we have done a completely different building in Valley Forge. Our design was burrowed into the landscape. The landscape rolled over the top. We had all the space we needed to stretch our wings, as it were. In Philadelphia, we're surrounded by the First Bank, National Bank, and the Second Bank, and a huge custom house, which is now Homeland Security, and other things. And we have a very tight but very interesting site, and the design is completely different and much more reflective of the American Georgian architecture which prevailed in Philadelphia.
With a Robert Stern twist.
With a Robert Stern twist.
Might you explain something about that design?
It's hard to explain the twist without showing it. You just have to take the twist.
Did we see a slide of it earlier?
No, I don't remember. Yes, Gary says yes. But I think it's interesting about the site in Philadelphia. Many of you perhaps have been there, but when I was growing up, the site in Philadelphia was being carved out. They tore down almost all the 19th century buildings past about 1830 in the area of Independence Hall to create this green park setting for Independence Hall and this mall in imitation in part of the mall in Washington. It was a complete desecration of great Victorian buildings. I look around this room, I see so many Victorian buildings in New York from Barbaralee book. It would be as though the Ladies' Mile was torn down, or Flatiron District, and they tore down buildings by, in particular, the great architect Frank Furness, just like that. And they reduced the Independence Hall. It now is more or less the scale of a comfort station in this vast park. It was once a towering building among low Georgian buildings. So they completely changed the meaning. Of course, now that I propose this, a design that echoes the architecture of the early Republic and the decisive moment in 1776, people say, well, why don't you make a modern building? I said, well, because you already made so many modern buildings. The Liberty Bell has practically been on roller skates going from one terrible pavilion to another terrible pavilion. Why don't you give it up and try to build back the city and the fabric of the city? So that's the context that I've been working in. It's not easy. But it's it's not easy to be an architect, but it's fun.
Now let's go to another context. Let's address the George W. Bush Library and Study Center. Other than your mutual degrees from Yale, I wonder if you could share some design ideas that you share with President and Mrs. Bush, since your work is not thought of as being typical of the Southwest.
Well, the Bush Library is on a site which was acquired from Southern Methodist University. SMU is a relatively new university. It's a 20th century university, around 1900 it was founded.
Of which
And it has
Mrs.
a
Bush
red-
is a graduate. Of which Mrs. Bush
Mrs. Bush is a graduate. Laura Bush is a graduate at SMU. George Bush went to Yale. SMU is a Georgian campus, and it's a completely Georgian-style campus. Different periods of the Georgian revival from 1900 to the moment are reflected there. Some is more Beaux-Arts influenced, some is more academic. We correct to the 18th century. And the president, speaking for the trustees of the university, made one demand of the Bushes and the people who said it had to be Georgian. Well, the Bushes did not want to be in a Georgian building, not because they're against Georgian architecture, but they thought it should be something a little more distinct on the site. So I have concocted something which is now called Essence of Georgia. I'm going to be able to bottle it also.
What is this? And a candle.
It's a reduced, clear, kind of almost Beaux-Arts clarity to the plan. It is red brick. It's a very, it's a highly sophisticated building from the point of view of environmentalism in a place like Dallas, which has extremely hot summers, short but very cold winters, and ice storms and other things. It's a very tough climate. And so we've met all those expectations. The building is very complex. Probably many of you know that actually presidential libraries are not paid for by the taxpayers. They're paid for by private citizens like you or people in some libraries in Saudi Arabia, but not the Bush Library paid for by Americans.
Are you telling us something?
No, it's absolutely true. When another presidential library was, finally the donors were revealed, it turned out to be many foreign oil people.
Will that be the case here
No,
too?
no, the list is public and it's all American. But it is also like Herbert Hoover, who established a think tank to espouse his ideas, and Bill Clinton in Little Rock. This too will have a Bush Institute, but it's in the same building as the library. And of course, there's a museum. These days, the public thinks of a library, it's really a museum they go to. But then there are...
Museum of the History of that
the Bush
president's-
administration. And, but one of the things that's interesting about the library today, a problem for today, which is virtually going to plague all libraries from here on, is the internet. The White House generates approximately 1 million emails a day. Not just the President's office, but what we call the White House. How to store them, how to preserve them for the future, is a complete new game. So it's not paper that we're worried about, it's electronic data. And so this library is a first
So your
21st century
digital
library.
experts
Oh,
under
the
staff,
National Archives,
they provide
they
this.
provide the expertise, and they are charged, that is a public agency, they are charged with the responsibility of running it. I see Barbara Goldsmith, who's intimately involved with the New York Public Library, and she's nodding, because the big fight and struggle with the public library in New York, which we all know about, has to do with entering the digital age, kicking and screaming. People love books.
No, especially at that building.
I'm not going to get into it, but I just thought I'd mention it in passing. But it is very, the Bush Library will open in April. There's a specific date in April of 2013.
There are many people in this room and elsewhere who wish they had the wit and or the funds to buy an apartment at 15 Central Park West, which has turned out to be the best investment any place, anywhere. Are there any new apartment buildings on the drawing board? I've heard a rumor that Larry Silverstein is interested in your development.
Oh, no, we have designed a building for Larry Silverstein next to the Trade Center, which will be a Four Seasons hotel and condominium apartments above. And actually, the foundation is in the ground. It's right behind the Woolworth building, and I read in the Times yesterday, I think, that the Woolworth building is, the upper floors are going to be condominiumized themselves. So I haven't had a chance to talk to Larry, find out what he feels about that. He probably
Top
knew
30
about it.
floors will
Yeah.
be converted to condominiums.
Our tower is approximately the height of the Woolworth building. Of course, if any of you are thinking of buying an apartment, you will, of course, be able to get the service of the hotel in your apartment, which will be very attractive to many people in
Does the
South.
style echo the limestone of 15th Central Park West?
Yes, it's in that vocabulary, yes, but it's a slender needle-like tower rising up very, very high, very thin tower, very high, some cases of one apartment per floor. But we think that will start construction again in the beginning of 2013. That's the expectation. And then there's another building we're doing, just while I'm selling real estate. For the Zeckendorfs, the same developers, an Eyal Offer, who developed 15 Central Park West, is the former Evangeline residence on Gramercy Park, where we were allowed by the Landmarks Commission to adjust the sizes of the windows slightly lower and slightly wider, which has made a dramatic change, an imperceptible change from the outside, and a dramatic change from the quality of the apartment inside. And they're one apartment per floor, and they will start marketing them, I'm sure, right after Labor Day. So,
How many apartments in the building?
18 or something like that. I might be wrong by that, but it's one per floor, and everybody gets a key to Gramercy Park.
As you heard earlier, being an architect requires a great deal of patience. But many are under the impression that an architect comes up with an idea, an inspired idea, works long hours to execute the design, and then it gets constructed. Well, in reality, a field of forces comes into play. Developers, bankers, contractors, lawyers, concerned citizens, all are involved in the design process. So how do you take an idea and shape it into a desirable reality?
Well, it's an iterative and a reiterative process. I think you characterized it correctly. And even, when you design a house for a single client, there's an iteration. You go back and forth, you have a concept, and then as you get to peel the concept open and study every room, every detail, and so forth, the concept evolves. You hope that the basic idea holds, and the detail or execution of it evolves. In the public sector, and every building today is involved, in any major city in the world, is involved with the public sector. You cannot, there's no such thing hardly in any place called an as-of-right building. The developer has to get some kind of permission for something or other. And so the architect with the developer has to go before the public bodies and make some trades. In New York City, Amanda Burden, I've known for a very, very long time and like very, very much, has done an amazing job representing the public in the quality of life about what it means to have a city street. And she's not there to pick the design. She sometimes does, but we don't talk about that. But to get the buildings to be the best possible citizens in the public sphere. Parks, the street frontages, shop fronts, and all of that. So you do sit down with Amanda, and we do work together.
Give a little and get a little.
Give a little, you get a lot.
Now, by now, somebody must be inspired to ask a question, but we're asking you to pass it forward. If you'll hold up the card, volunteers will pick it up. Beyond CAD drawings, how much of architecture today is dictated by technology?
Well, CAD drawings are that's the kind of the drafting services of architecture. It's the bottom line. The computer has opened up wide possibilities for architects, and maybe too wide, too undisciplined. Sometimes I worry as a dean that the laws, forces of gravity have been forgotten, but that eventually works itself out. But also the computer and digital fabrication, the ability of a computer to guide the process of actually making something, to run a saw or a drill or whatever, cut, carve, shape, and so forth, has changed the whole relationship, potentially, between what an architect designs and how it can be executed in the field. You can make any kind of shape you want. You can make traditional classical shapes or way out extraordinary non-rectilinear shapes through handling the computer. And it does mean that the relationship between the architect and the contractor and all the fabrication in between is constantly in play today. We are in a very unstable period. Even out here where you have wonderful craftsmen, builders, but you know, in houses I walk through when we're working on today with Gary and I mean, a lot of the woodworking is done on computers in a shop somewhere in Minnesota or something abroad. And the workmanship is fantastic. So the whole thing is changing. And in a way, we're back to what Ruskin talked about, which was that architecture should involve the craft of making something as a fundamental tenet of architecture. And for a long time, we were away from that, thinking that machine production meant everything had to be exactly alike. But now, the idea of the computer allows for what's called mass customization. So, you get it in your BMW, you might get it in your building soon.
How important is the power of presentation, verbal as well as visual, in the art of architecture, and to the realization of any project?
Well, I'm a very inarticulate fellow, as you know, but most of my colleagues are extremely articulate.
Isn't that
And some
necessary?
have a special, they develop a special charm and vocabulary, and nobody knows quite what they're saying. It's extremely good. And I can do that from time to time if I have to. Verbal presentation is extremely important. And, you know, most architects whose names you know are highly educated and highly articulate. And visual presentation, it used to be the drawing, and people love the sketch still. I think the sketch is the fundamental connection between the brain and the eye and the problem at hand. But the computer allows you to make simulations of things that I sometimes think, why do we bother building our buildings? They have this beautiful 3D model. I mean, it's so fantastic. It doesn't have to be dusted or anything like that. But it's amazing. It's amazing. And so there are people, not the architects who you probably encounter, but people who work for the architects who do nothing but make presentations, graphic presentations of projects. So it's a total different world from when I studied architecture at Yale in the early 1960s, when Paul Rudolph, my teacher and great architect, said, an office should be about 30 people. That was perfect. That, he could control the 30 people, the 30 people that way. By the time he died in the late 1990s, he realized he'd given bad advice and taken it himself as a mistake, which limited his capacity to function as an architect. So the world has changed. Everybody says the world is always different, but there are significant differences in the world of architecture that happened in the last 10 years.
Other than talent and charisma, what's the most important quality for an architect to possess?
Oh my God. Talent, charisma, patience, which I don't have much of.
Somehow you've muddled through.
I muddled through, yes. I think talent and organizational skills. The architect is the person at a complicated project that often everybody looks to for some sort of resolution of the complexity of the project. It's quite interesting. Architects are among the last generalists, at least that's the way we think of our way we teach architecture at Yale, the last humanists and the last generalists. They do have a big overview. And it's true, if you talk to someone like Frank Gehry, you realize it can gather together all kinds of people and put them at ease with each other and think things through and get projects built. I mean, that building in Bilbao was no slam dunk to realize. And Tom Krenz, a brilliant guy, but he has even less patience than I do. And I think Frank probably got a lot of that through. So.
What was your first experience as an architect?
I built a little house in Montauk for my college roommate. And he lived there happily until he wasn't living happily ever after with his wife. Usual story, but we got the house built and photographed. And it's still there. It's been added on to it. The people who live in it love it. And they're always saying, oh, come and see it. You can't go back. I mean, I can't do it.
Is there any building type or architectural style that interests you currently?
Architectural styles are always interesting to me. And I'm always looking at new building. And I give a seminar. I only teach one little thing at Yale. I teach a seminar called Parallel Modern. Because I was raised on the belief that there was only a very narrow trajectory, basically Alfred Barr at the MoMA, that set it out. Narrow trajectory. But in architecture, it was Frank Lloyd Wright, Corbusier, Mies, Gropius we paid attention to, he was at Harvard. And then there were the children of those, Philip Johnson, Paul Rudolph, and so on, who were always wrestling for daddy's attention in architectural terms. I give a seminar that says, well, they weren't the only kinds of modern architects practicing in the early 20th century. There were many, many other architects who were doing amazing things who got shunted to the side. And I think if you follow the way curators are exploring the world of painting and sculpture of the 20th century, they're also doing similar things, discovering other things. So it's a kind of postmodern exploration of a wider realm. So I find these architects and students research them, they often come up with amazing things, and so I'm interested in them. And of course, like any good artist, I'm a vacuum cleaner. I hoover everything up. That's the secret.
Well, tell us a few more.
No, you have all these questions. Maybe we should answer some of these.
Let me just ask you a few more,
Okay.
and then we'll turn to the audience. In a much-discussed recent book, The Temporary City, the authors Bishop and Williams lament the absence of new ideas in big architecture and urbanism. To them, the only real innovation is the now ubiquitous pop-up store. How would you amend their thinking?
What book is this?
The Temporary City.
I don't know the book, so I don't know the argument. You've gone seldom to my lost for an answer. I think the debate about cities in the world today is between the continuation and evolution of the traditional city, whether it's Manhattan or Brooklyn, or even a village like Southampton, or the kind of a city that has grown up of towers sitting in parking lots with vast spaces in between them, which Ram Koolhaas has called junk space, to describe the space around it and to characterize it. And many of the places in the world that are being developed, like Dubai, large parts of Chinese cities, correspond to the second model of no-place places. And the struggle is to somehow rein those places in. The place that's trying to rein them in most successfully, the kind of space I'm describing, the junk space, was Las Vegas, the Strip. But Las Vegas, especially just until the meltdown, the financial meltdown, was going back and turning the Strip into, it's a pedestrian strip. People walk the Strip now. In 1970, nobody walked on the Strip, not even the hookers walked the Strip. Now, everybody's walking the Strip. So those are the debates I know about urbanism. Pop-up stores, that just doesn't seem like a solution. That just seems like kind of symptom.
We've all been told that because of the economic downturn, that the cultural building boom is decidedly over. And the trend now is toward a very old idea of adaptive reuse of existing buildings in cultural districts that link various smaller organizations. What suggestions do you have for the building that we are now in, soon to become the Southampton Art Center? Any thoughts about the repurposing of this building?
I didn't get the project.
Is that the only word?
If they wanted to know what I thought, I would tell them.
Your firm was recently honored by SPLEA for the efforts to restore the Dominial Carpenter House and turn them into the new East Hampton Town Hall facilities. What local efforts can you envision that will foster preservation in Suffolk County?
Well, I think that's a sweeping, that's a big, tall, hard answer, but I think we do need to, first of all, we have to preserve the open space in Suffolk County. That's the first line of defense. Second of all, we have to try to curb our excess sizes of houses. And I know everybody thinks I've done the biggest houses out here. It's not true. I never even wanted to do the biggest houses out here. But there are too big houses, and that can be curbed by legislation. In Aspen, Colorado, it has been curbed to some extent. And then the question is to try to save as many of the old buildings and repurpose them. In the history of the world, repurposing buildings has been the typical way of building. Only rarely do you build new buildings. The Colosseum in Rome has had multiple uses over its very long history. The Pantheon in Rome it's still a Christian church, but before that it was a pagan shrine and so forth. To name just but two obvious examples. The Louvre is a palace made into a museum. So we have to do that. We have been building too many museums, and particularly on the assumption that they will save the institutions. They don't save the institutions. We know they're very expensive to run. People come and see them the first time in the new buildings, and it's all the talk, and then they move on. People are fickle. So then you are still left with the problem of creatively filling the institutions up with a program that people will come to. So we are seeing that. I don't think it's just the decline of the economy that is causing people to question the building of so many new super institutions. It's the fact that the Bilbao factor worked in Bilbao, but it didn't work in Denver, didn't work in many other places. It's just not it's not a formula for success. It was a wonderful one-off condition. So maybe I'm not answering your question, but I'm a great believer in reusing buildings. And I came into the story when Soho was not Soho. It was all those cast iron buildings there. And I signed letters to try to get it so that artists who were living there illegally, Klaus Curtis was enlisting my support and many other people, to just get people not to be thrown out, of spaces that had no other purpose. And now we know what's happening.
Former factory building.
Factory buildings in lower Manhattan. And all of Manhattan has been, say, the development community is often against preservation unwisely, I think, because if they're good developers, they can be good redevelopers just as well. So we won't go on to that.
But if you read the real estate ads, they may not be for it during the process, but ad after ad reflects, come see our landmark building.
Of course.
Because they obviously think that it adds some dimension, some value to the site.
Well, this is a long, and maybe another subject, but or maybe it's a fundamental one we get into, but one thing is that if you have a landmark district, which I know people resist on the East End, it stabilizes the community. And you don't worry that some bullhonk will take the house next door that's perfectly lovely and tear it down and build something stupid, which has happened in Southampton and East Hampton and other nice communities. So preservation of districts is very, very important if you, just on a purely selfish economic basis. Yes, it's a bit of a pain for the property owner to have to do certain things, and yes, they can't do everything they want, but then again, you can't drive on the wrong side of the road, can you, just because you feel like it. You have to play by the rules. So I think that much more could be done to educate people. And Barbaralee she's a pioneer of this, as you know, she wouldn't be doing this.
But I feel, I'm so glad you brought it up. For New York City, which now has 108 historic districts, plus 18 extensions, in addition to 1,338 individually designated landmarks, plus interiors, plus scenic landmarks, the historic districts is what has transformed the face of New York City. It is, just as Robert said, a very stabilizing influence, and I would hope those who live here urge those who help legislate. I think there's a meeting going on tonight. There was a very nice reply from our mayor saying he would be here, except there is a meeting, a regular planning meeting going on. But I encourage all of you to look closely at historic districts if you care about the stabilization of your communities. What do you consider your greatest contribution? Is it a building, an idea, a theory, or maybe an attitude?
I think it's an attitude. It's the embodiment of a lifelong belief that architecture is important and that it has many ways that its importance can take shape. The written word, the spoken word, the built word, the preserved building, and so forth. So architecture is a culture. I believe it's a culture. Music is a culture and so forth. And I think when I started architecture, in architecture, the prevailing wisdom was that architecture was about functional and technological realizations. And I think that's too narrow of a statement. Architecture is a culture.
Many people have asked questions here. What made you decide to be an architect? They even went so far as to ask if you played with blocks as a child, pre-Lego here.
Lego didn't exist when I was a child, to my knowledge at least. I did play with blocks, and I played with them, and I made little drawings of cities. But I think what really got me into it was that I grew up, I was born in 1939, and when I was a young kid, after the Second World War, there was lots of conversation among the family and everyone about what the future of New York would be. Some people said that the city would be, the Fifth Avenue would be paved over with green. They didn't need money, they meant grass, that everyone would flee to the suburbs. And there was a lot of that going on. On the other hand, the United Nations Secretariat was being built, and the Lever House were both being built at the same time. Happened, my dentist's office was down the block from the Lever House. And I one day saw this building and I thought, oh my God, this is something. And although it has many deficiencies that I could give you a very boring academic lecture about, it was pretty exciting. So those things all coalesced in my mind. And I loved, in those days in the New York Times real estate pages, Whereas now, the emphasis about this, two unmarried people finding bliss in a perfect apartment or something like that. In those days, it was all plans of suburban houses. This developer was opening up Cedarhurst, and there were these plans, and I would start to draw over them because I could do much better plans age 13 than the ones they were building. I assure you, I can still do better plans, too, in case you
Did
need
Mr.
something.
Levitt know that?
Mr. Levitt wasn't bad. No, he was pretty good. His plans were good but there were others that were terrible, and I would redraw them, and then I would tell my parents why their plans were terrible. Then they knew they had trouble on their hands.
If you had it to do over again, what would you do otherwise?
Oh, I can't. I don't know. I haven't. I've made so many mistakes, but then again, here I am. I'm still here, as Yvonne DiCarlo says in Follies.
You know, a number of people have asked some very good questions. In fact, so many of them that I think that I will share with you that we are going to have this conversation redux with new questions on December 15th at the New York Historical Society, when the Landmarks of New York, this exhibition, which has been traveling to 14 cities throughout New York State, will finally arrive in New York City, and Robert Stern and I are going to have a conversation on December 15th. So if your question doesn't get asked tonight, please come then. But in the meantime, here's a good question. If you were to create a world-class resort in Southampton without spoiling the feeling of it, what would you do? There hasn't been a hotel room built in 40 years.
Maybe that's a good thing.
Okay? Actually, that was owned by, that question was asked by an innkeeper. What is the impact of scale on aesthetics in architecture? A house of 3,000 square feet, the same architecture at 20,000 square feet.
Well, scale is the relationship of part to part in a building, and also the relationship of those parts to the human body. So you can make a very large building, whether it's a house or a skyscraper for that matter, that still has, because of the way the parts are organized, human scale. You break apart, for example, a big building into pavilions or other strategies that can be developed. The use of materials that, why do people like brick or stone, for example, as opposed to curtain walls of glass? Why do they feel better about them? Many people, not all, of course, but it's partially the scale of a brick. You see the workmen putting the brick up in the wall. It's something you can do yourself if you chose to. So that gives you a human scale. But huge buildings like the Empire State Building is not an overwhelming building. Never has been, even though it was for a very long time the world's tallest building. Whereas some big glass buildings built in Shanghai and elsewhere, where because they're just one shape and nothing happens at the bottom to differentiate how they reach the ground, where they address the scale of the size of human beings, seem scaleless and threatening. It's a good question, but you'll have to come to Yale. We'll give you 3 years, $100,000.
$100,000.
A little more than $100,000. Well, it's tough to get into Yale.
Please comment on the beautiful job you did renovating and restoring Guildhall in East Hampton, asked, not surprisingly, by the director of Guildhall.
Oh, Ruth Almoff is here. She's very nice. But it was a wonderful project, very complicated. The Guildhall was built in 1931 to provide, not for summer people so much as the year-round people, for culture by the family who had been providing musical and art shows in their house, really. And they were getting older, and they'd already built and paid for the library 20 years before. Anyhow, the John Dew Theater is a wonderful small theater, but hadn't been touched, literally, in 50 years. And so everyone said, what are we going to do? So we just simply went back and researched all the colors and repainted it, but then we did things that you don't see. Proper air conditioning, better sight lines, we tricked the seating, we put in green rooms and dressing rooms for the actors. They were practically changing on in the backyard. It was causing quite an embarrassment for people. It was real. And then the concept of the galleries, there were 2 galleries originally, left and right as you come in. One of them was, the original photos, it's like a sitting room. It's like a kind of, you'd have tea there and so forth. Well, that's nice, but not the way we do it anymore. So we tried to save the architectural quality of the space and address it. It's very difficult to do that kind of renovation. It's an imperfect art, but the building is there, and it's got another 50 years of life in it, I would believe. People seem to like it.
Here are 2 questions that are linked and that you've made inferences to during the course of our conversation. How has architectural education changed in the 21st century? And if you were starting out now in architecture, what would be your stylistic emphasis?
I can't say what it would be like for me to be a first-year student at the Yale School of Architecture now. I probably wouldn't get in. That would be the first thing. But I think going back to what I was trying to refer to before, the introduction of the computer, electronic communication with drawing and so forth, which is just opening, has changed the whole methodology of teaching. And we did have a symposium which 500, 600 people attended each session, which is a huge number to come to a symposium in the School of Architecture at Yale, which I didn't organize it, but I instigated it. That's what I usually do. And I gave it its name, Is Drawing Dead? Taking up from the Time magazine cover of my youth, where they said, Is God Dead? And the real question, and it's been written about all around the world. It touched a chord in architects. Everybody recognizes the electronic world and what it can do and what it can mean for the practice of architecture, as it does transform the practice of art. But the nervousness is that that architects will lose touch with the earlier hand-eye coordination that sketches and so forth mean. That the compulsion of the projected images, power of it is so great that people will throw drawing to the wind. Well, we're committed not to doing that at Yale. And I'm sure there are prospective students who apply to architecture schools and don't want to come to Yale. They think maybe we're an old fuddy-duddy place. We still teach drawing, hand drawing. Well, so be it. We're fuddy-duddy, but we'll win the race, I'm convinced.
You mentioned earlier the size of New York and its growth. Plan New York City projects that in the year 2030, New York City's population will expand from 8 million to 9 million. What should the city be doing to provide for this great spurt in growth?
Well, lots of things are happening, some by accident and some by planning. I mean, the Second Avenue subway, which was started the year I was born. So they tore down the L. So, I might live to see it actually run, and it's a block away from my apartment in New York. Who knows?
A building which you designed.
Yes, indeed. So when things are happening, the extension of the 7 train, things like that. But then the swelling of the population has turned Brooklyn. I'm a Brooklyn boy. I couldn't wait to get out of Brooklyn. Now everybody wants to go to Brooklyn. I'm afraid I'll like it. And I'd like to go, and I'll be back there again.
You just said you can't go back.
You can't go back.
But cool Brooklyn might interest you.
Thomas Wolfe said, only the dead know Brooklyn, referring in an essay to the fact that it was just a borough of so many cemeteries. But I think the swelling of the population has forced the reinvention of neighborhoods and the reuse of buildings in the outer boroughs, and it's fabulous. It's fabulous what's happening. And if you just go off, even on Manhattan, just go up to Harlem and drive around, or take a bus or walk. I mean, what has been done there is astonishing. And all over the city. So we can take more people. We definitely can take more people.
1 million more?
Yes. Of course, the old master plan for the city called for 20 million at one point. The original zoning.
Yes, but that was then and this is now.
Yeah. Well,
but there are some...
But if they're, as long as they're it's dispersed population to some extent. It's the infrastructure that suffers, the subway systems. I mean, of course, there are many problems. But things are being done. And I even read in the paper, we don't want to project this for too long, but Metro North is going to have stations in the Bronx. What an idea. Perfectly simple.
Yep.
Not even expensive.
How do you see the future of New York in terms, in front, I think it's in, what's that word? Maybe it means, what he's really talking about, the future of New York with such buildings as 432 Park Avenue.
The person who's asking this question is the developer of the tallest building going under construction. He signed it, so it says truth in advertising.
Yes, we
on
believe
57th
that
Street.
in our household.
I'm not going to
But
say
he
it.
says, and the ratio of services, such as sidewalks, electricity, garbage disposal. But what will those developers do when they impose so much bulk to create amenities that others will not be imposed on? Maybe we should get him to answer that.
It's a problem. But these huge buildings, let's face it, they're not always occupied all the time. I believe the ratio of occupancy in buildings like 15 Central Park West and others is about 30% at any given time. So people are buying these apartments to have in New York for various reasons. Not only are they international people, but say in 15 Central Park West, there are many people from that foreign country called California who suddenly realize that it's very dull in California most of the time. And you can
Are you
just
finished
watch,
with
you
your
can just-
Disney assignment?
Yes, I'm not on the board anymore. And you can just do so much with an avocado, and so they want to be in New York.
I'm so touched by the need of this person to ask a question. I assume you may be a student or an architect, and I'm going to address it to you. When you get an idea, how closely does the product resemble the first spark? How do you think the two relate, and what do you think of them?
It's a hit and miss proposition, but I think very often, after you kind of immerse yourself in the problem of the building, what has to be accommodated, what's the site, and all those things, you can. An architect who is a design architect can come up with a sketch of how the building will be. And you try to hold to that sketch all the way through. The Beaux-Arts system of education constantly drilled young architects into that process, that within 12 hours they had to be able to design a building. And then they could conceptualize a building, and then they could have 4 months, 6 months, whatever, to work it out. And if they didn't present the building at the end of that process, that was a worked out version of the first design, they were HC, haute concours, thrown out. That was the methodology. And so you can do it. And that's actually the way architects are tested for licensing. 12 hours, you have to design a building. So it can be done quickly, but you know, there's a long distance between da-da-da-da, good opening line, and the symphony. Okay?
Mr. Stern, do you always wear yellow socks? Is that your trademark, and are there any others?
Other trademarks or other socks?
Both, I hope.
I don't know. I do wear yellow socks a lot because somebody about 10 years ago on the Yale faculty, I was wearing a pair of yellow socks, but I had others. She said, you know, Fred Astaire always wore yellow socks. I love Fred Astaire. So I immediately bought every pair of yellow socks I could find that I could get my hands on. And I threw out every other color I had, except occasionally I have some light blue ones because he did wear light blue ones also.
Well, thank you for dancing with us tonight. It really was a great, great pleasure. Thank you for your thoughtful, interesting, and amusing comments. And thanks to each and all of you for joining us as well.
Thank you very much.
We'll come back on August 23rd, which will be the last session of Thursdays at 6:30, and the guest will be David Rockwell,